Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 148. And just a little catch up on what happened last time. We saw the end of Nelson Strong, the man who was hired by the government to catch Swamp Thing, and also had a lifelong vendetta to get Swamp Thing because he had a vision when he was a child that Swamp Thing would kill him. And even though he had that vision and it showed him exactly how Swamp Thing was going to do it, I guess it must have been fate and it was meant to happen, because even though he tried to change it, it still happened. He still died the way he saw in his vision. And I gotta say, that was a pretty epic fight. We saw Swamp Thing take out all the soldiers by growing tulips out of their bodies. And in the end, he smashed Nelson Strong with a bus. But what Swamp Thing doesn't know is that the prophecy didn't end there. The reason why Nelson Strong was prophesied to die is so that he can be the champion of the Parliament of Stones. So after he was smashed by Swamp Thing, we saw an interaction between him, or his spirit, I guess, and the Parliament of Stones, but we haven't yet seen him become their champion. So at the end of last issue, we saw Swamp Thing escaping the Netherlands by hitching a ride on the bottom of a truck that was going into Germany. So finally, Swamp Thing has made it to Germany. And if you remember from the beginning of this run, that was kind of the main goal of him coming to Europe in the first place, because he was told by a mysterious old traveler that the only way to release himself from the Parliament of Trees is to fight them in the Black Forest. So first things first, with issue 148, we got the cover. We see Swamp Thing is sitting on top of a hill. He is in side profile, and he is in the thinking man's position. So he's resting his arms on his legs, and he's got his head propped up on one of his hands. And there's some like smoke or fog in the background. And in that we can see some really grotesque looking people. There seems to be some kind of monster as well. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Mark Miller with art by Phil Hester and Kim DeMolder. And as we turn to the first page, we see a semi-truck driving down a road, and the hills around are covered with snow, and it is snowing. And the caption says that this is the Black Forest in Germany. And from that semi-truck that's driving down the road, we hear the driver say, "You don't talk much, do you? I must have picked you up about 60 miles back, and you haven't even told me your name." Then we cut to inside the cab, and we see a female trucker driving, and we see she has a passenger who is a white woman with black hair, and both are wearing heavy coats because obviously it's winter, but the passenger is also holding on to some kind of doll. So the woman passenger says, "I'm sorry, my name's Grace Brady." And the driver has noticed that Grace is holding on to that doll, and she says, "Well, that's a real nice doll you got there, Grace. Pretty as a picture. I never had any dolls when I was a girl. My dad bought me a pool table instead. Crazy old man. Used to make me practice every single night." And Grace seems pretty shy. She's just staring down at her doll. But it does seem that the truck driver has broken the ice. And so Grace says, "My uncle got me this doll for my 6th birthday. He made it out of lumps of clay and human hair when he was in prison. He used to be a supervillain." And I gotta tell you, this doll looks great for having been made in prison out of clay and human hair. I mean, it looks like it was bought out of a store. So he was a really good doll maker. So at the information that Grace's uncle was a supervillain, the truck driver perks up and says, "A supervillain? You're putting me on. That's terrific. Must have been full of great stories." And Grace replies, "No, not really. In fact, he hardly ever spoke at all." Then we see the truck pass another hitchhiker, and he is holding a sign that says Freeburg on it. And Grace says, "Hey, look, there's another hitchhiker up ahead. Should we pull over and give him a ride?" And the truck driver replies, "Not on your life, girl. I don't like to stop around this place, even for gas." And Grace looks kind of worried at this and asks, "What do you mean?" And the driver replies, "There's something weird about this town. Maybe it's too close to the Black Forest. I mean, that place has a bad history, you know? Shit, maybe I'm just superstitious. I don't know." And Grace is looking more worried, and she says, "Thanks a bunch. I've got to spend a couple of days here." But the truck driver tries to recover, and she says, "Hey, come on, I didn't mean to scare you. I'm just asking you to be careful. Take my advice, girl. Don't hang around the streets, and check into the first hotel you find and lock the door. God only knows what you might bump into in this neck of the woods." And as she says this, we cut to Swamp Thing, who's looking at the semi-truck drive down the road from one of the snow-covered hills. And we're seeing the back of him in that panel, but as we turn the page, we get a front view of him, and he is looking pretty rough. I think the snow is having an effect on him. He's looking kind of sluggish, and there's icicles growing off of his arms. And we see the name of this issue is Feeding Habits. Then we cut to Gotham City in an apartment building, and we're seeing two police officers question a man about his wife. And the younger of the police officers says, "Your wife's been missing almost a week, Mr. Brady. Don't you think you should have called us before now?" And Mr. Brady is looking pretty calm. He's sitting on a couch smoking, and he very nonchalantly says, "Jesus, we had a fight, all right. I thought maybe Grace just needed a couple days to cool off." And the officer asks, "Can you think of any friends she might be staying with?" And the husband replies, "Grace never had any friends. Not any since she gave up her job. She just sat on her ass watching TV all day while I tried to run a business. Hard life, huh?" And the officer asks, "Do you remember what this fight was about?" And the husband answers, "Sure I do. She got a letter from some crank swearing he was her dead uncle. She wanted me to check him out, see if the asshole was for real." And the other older detective, who's been looking around the house, looking for clues about where Grace could have gone, is intrigued by what the husband said about Grace asking him to look for her uncle. So he asks, "Well, what did you say?" And the husband replies, "I told her to go screw herself. What would you do? Her uncle left her a magic ruby in his will, and the letter said he wanted it back. His name was Sargon the Sorcerer, big supervillain in the 60s, but you probably never heard of him." And the younger detective says, "A supervillain? Maybe we ought to pass this one on to the Department of Superhuman Activities, huh?" And the husband says, "Take it easy. Sargon's dead. I saw the corpse and everything. Probably just some fanboy prick who wants a look at his magic gem." And the older detective walks over to the husband and he crosses his arms like he's suspicious, and he asks, "Your wife doesn't sound like a very happy woman, Mr. Brady. Do you think she might have left you for someone else?" And the husband replies, "Ha! You think Grace is having an affair? Don't be ridiculous. Jesus, who the hell would want to have sex with Grace?" Then we cut to the town of Freiburg in Germany, and we see Grace Brady is walking in the streets, so we know where Grace Brady is. And I guess she just got dropped off here by the trucker. So as she's walking down the street, we get some narration that says, "Grace Brady didn't know what to do. Her first instinct was to call her husband, but she promised herself she would handle this alone. Her husband said Uncle Johnny was dead. The weird letter she'd received had been sent by some kind of crank, he said. Besides, he was far too busy to even talk about that shit. Grace imagined how worried Paul must be right now. She didn't leave a note when she packed her bags, and she wondered if maybe she should give him a call, just to let him know she was okay. No, screw him, she thought. Paul deserved to sweat a little. Besides, her Uncle Johnny was holed up in the Black Forest. It said so in his letter. He wouldn't let anything happen to his own flesh and blood. So under this narration, we're seeing her walk down the street, and when she sees a payphone, that's when she's thinking about calling Paul. But then we see her walk into a hotel, and the streets have been normal so far as she's been walking. But as she walks into this hotel, we see there's a man walking another man like a dog. And the one imitating a dog is naked from the waist down. And from the waist up, he's wearing a leather jacket, a studded leather collar, and a leather hat. And even though this is Germany, I'm going to assume that this is not a normal custom and that this is actually a hint that there is some evil going on in the town. So inside the hotel, Grace is checking in, and the old woman at the front desk says, "I must warn you that my son and I expect certain standards in this hotel, Miss Brady. There must be no smoking in these premises, and we forbid the use of alcohol." And as the old woman hands Grace the key, Grace says, "Don't worry about me. I've never touched a drop in my life." And the old lady says, "I think you will be a fine guest. You seem like a nice, clean girl." And then Grace goes up the stairs to her room, but as she does, we see the old woman and her son are creepily watching her go up the stairs. And the narration over this panel says, "There was something foul on the landlady's breath, something old and terrible. Grace Brady thought she'd recognized it for a moment." Then we get a front view of the mom and son, and they are looking creepy still, and the narration continues saying, "She is the one," they whispered, their heads bobbing gently, and their speech slightly slurred. "She is the one the sorcerer told us would come." Then we cut to the room of Grace where she is taking a bath. And in the bath, she's just sitting naked, but she is still holding onto the doll that her uncle made her in prison. And she looks either depressed or maybe troubled from her thoughts. And as she sits in the tub, the narration over these panels says, "Grace Brady soaked in the tub until her bath turned cold, and 2 days' dirt formed a skin on the water. She just couldn't stop thinking about her dead uncle. She'd identified his charred remains for the cops and watched as his coffin was lowered into the ground, but she still refused to believe he was dead. As his only relative, she'd inherited everything he owned, but all he had left in the world was his precious ruby. She kept it for him in a little pouch, fully aware she was only its caretaker. A man like Sargon could never truly die. Grace knew that one day he would want it back. And as she sits in the tub, we see her eyeing this pouch that she has set on the lid of the toilet, and inside this pouch is the gem of Sargon, her uncle. So you might have guessed, but Sargon is a DC character from the 50s and the 60s, and we've actually seen Sargon before in the Alan Moore run. You might recall in issue 50, when the Crisis on Infinite Earth was happening, John Constantine had gathered a bunch of mystical and supernatural heroes and villains to help stop the blackness or the void that had been called forth from the Brujeria. And this void was going to take on heaven itself and destroy everything else in the process. So even bad guys were helping John with this, and one of those bad guys was Sargon the Sorcerer. Now, to be fair, he wasn't always bad. Sometimes he would be good, but by that time in the 80s, he was generally a bad guy. So to fight this black void, John had all the really strong supernatural people like Swamp Thing and Etrigan and the Spectre go into hell and fight the void. And John and the other more mental powered people were holding hands in a power circle and giving power to the other team that was fighting in hell. And this fighting was so intense that two people ended up spontaneously combusting. One of them was Zatanna's father, Zatara, and the other was Sargon the Sorcerer. So that is how Sargon died. And part of his character was that he would wear a turban that had a ruby crystal in the front of it. And that crystal is what gave Sargon his powers. So after his death, he left that crystal and anything else he had to his relative Grace Brady. All right, so now that you're all caught up, we cut to the city of Freeburg, where the trucker who parked Grace up is filling up at a gas station. And she goes over to the woman who's tending the pump, and she says, "Okay, lady, I got a full tank. What's the damage?" But the attendant doesn't answer her, and the attendant is at one of those little kiosks that's not really a full store. It's where you pay for the gas only. So the truck driver puts the Visa through the little hole in the window, but the attendant doesn't take it. And the truck driver says, "Hey, I'm ready to pay up. What's the problem? Don't you take Visa?" And now she's paying attention, and she kind of focuses on the attendant, and we see that it is an older woman who has a big evil grin on her face, and she's eating a fruit that seems to be bleeding. And the truck driver is very alarmed by this, and then she hears steps behind her, and she turns around, and she says, "Oh God, don't do this!" And it turns out that behind her, a bunch of townsfolk have gathered, and they all have different kinds of farm equipment for weapons. And they all begin to walk towards her, smiling very evilly. Then we cut to some farmland on the outskirts of Freeburg, and we see a farmer pull a vegetable out of the ground, and it looks like a turnip, but he's looking very worried as he notices that the turnip is bleeding, just like the fruit of the gas station attendant. And over these panels, we get the narration that says, "On the outskirts of Freeburg, Irving Klimt surveyed his crops. He had tended the land almost all of his days, but he'd never seen anything quite like this. What was happening beneath the ground? What was the soil trying to tell us?" The old man felt a sickness rise in his throat. A tingle of premonition fluttered in his gut. Something bad was in the air. He could smell it on the wind. A storm was brewing in Freeburg, deep beneath the earth. Then we cut back to Grace's room, and she is drying off from the tub. She's put on her bathrobe, and she's kind of walking around her room as she watches TV. And on the TV, there is a news report, and the reporter is saying, "A state of emergency has been declared in Holland after an attack on its capital by the Louisiana swamp monster. The Dutch police have blocked all roads into Amsterdam until they can ascertain whether the creature is still at large." And hearing this, Grace says, "Those poor people. Dear God, it's like Gotham all over again." And right there, she's referencing the events that happened during the Alan Moore run of Swamp Thing, where his lover, Abby Arcane, was arrested by Gotham police because she was sleeping with a non-human. So Swamp Thing had to go up there and smack down the police department and basically overgrew all of Gotham to force them to free her. And this news program actually has video footage of the attack. So we see the soldiers are growing tulips out of their bodies, and there's fire everywhere from Nathan Strong's flamethrowers. And the news reporter continues, "It is still unclear how many died in the beast's most violent assault to date, but aerial pictures suggest the death toll could be in the 4 figures. Senator Bob Dole has again urged the president to sanction superhuman intervention. Then we see Grace glance over to the potted plant on her windowsill, and she looks kind of concerned as if she's thinking maybe Swamp Thing will pop out of that plant. And as we turn the page, we see she has in fact taken that plant and placed it in the hallway outside of her door. And just as she's about to go in, she hears some weird noises from down below, and it's the son of the landlady saying, "Suck it up, mother. Drink the goodness." So of course, Grace is weirded out by that, and she decides to sneak close to the railing, and as she's peeking out, she sees the mother kneeling in front of the son down below, and he is holding out his hand, and she is sucking on his fingers. Then we cut closer to the son and mother, and we see that in his hand there is blood. I'm not sure if it's his blood or if it's supposed to be the blood of a fruit or a vegetable, as we saw in the previous two scenes. But either way, the mom is sucking the blood off of his hands, and he is saying, "Take your nourishment. Feed on the devil's sap." And of course, Grace is horrified at seeing this. And as we turn the page, we cut to Brazil, and we see Lady Jane is talking to the old traveler, the one who sent Swamp Thing on this journey to Germany in the first place. And Lady Jane is saying to him, "There is a sour taste in my mouth. Has the ordeal of the bleeding tree begun?" And the traveler replies, "It begins soon, Lady Jane. 50 years of careful cultivation by the sorcerer have at last borne fruit. The illumination takes place tonight." And Lady Jane says, "The human race is not ready for this elevation, traveler. The stars demand that they be guided by a more capable hand. Do you think the Earl King will be able to stop him?" And the traveler replies, "The sorcerer is an old adversary of mine. I have defeated him in the past, but he is not the man he was. Holland will find this final trial most difficult." And Lady Jane asks, "Does he understand what will happen if he enters the green again? Does he know what will be waiting for him?" And the traveler replies, "He has been warned." And Lady Jane says, "I have heard rumblings beneath the good earth, traveler. The Parliament of Stones have selected their champion, and they are already preparing him for battle." And the traveler says, "Holland will win. He is the one. I am certain of it." And Lady Jane says, kind of concerned, "I hope you are right. None of his predecessors, myself included, have passed the earth level. I fear time is running short for our kind. The stars will not wait forever." Then we cut back to Freiburg, Germany with Grace Brady, and she is walking through the snowy woods. And as she walks, the narration says, "Grace Brady checked her zip pocket for the 23rd time, but everything was fine. The ruby of life was still there. God alone knew why she was doing this. Her uncle didn't love her any more than her stupid fat husband did, but something stirred inside her when she read his letter. Perhaps blood was thicker than water after all." So in the letter that her uncle sent her, apparently there was a map that shows her a path through these woods to an X on the map. So as she's looking at that, a drip of something red falls from the trees above and splashes on the corner of the map, and then another drip falls and hits her on the cheek. And she looks up and she sees that the trees around, even though it's wintertime, have sprouted fruit and they're bleeding. And as she looks up at the tree, she says, "Oh God." And then she hears a whisper coming from the tree, and it's saying, "Feed the tree. It will tell you everything you need to know. See what feeds the roots of the Black Forest." So Grace walks over to the tree that has the bleeding fruit, and in the bark she can see handprints. So she puts her hands on the trunk, and immediately she is overcome with something. And then we turn the page and we get a full page splash where it seems that the tree is invading her mind, and she can see the root system of it. And at the bottom of that root system, there is a body. And it looks very desiccated, and there are roots digging into different parts of it. And seeing this body seems to make her snap out of it, so she's able to pull away. And as she does, you can see that her hands are kind of burning or smoking, kind of inferring that all those other hands on the trunk are also from people who have touched it, and it sucked their minds in as well. And when they pulled away, their burning hands left a mark too. And as she pulls away and sees her hand, she says, "Ah, my hand, it burned me." Then we see her walking towards a lodge, and it's snow covered and it kind of looks like no one's here. And I'm not sure if she just walked the rest of the way to the X on the map and we just skipped to that part, or if she literally just turned and there was the lodge, like she teleported or something. But as she approaches it, we hear some narration say, "You are wading into dark and dangerous waters, Sargon. Turn back now before it's too late." Then we turn the page and we're getting intercut scenes of, I guess, a time that Sargon fought the Justice Society of America, and it was inside this lodge. So I'm not sure if Grace is seeing this or hearing this, but for sure we are getting a little backstory about something that happened in these woods back when Sargon was alive and he was fighting the JSA. So we cut to the inside and we see Sargon floating in the center of this ballroom, and Sargon has his turban on and he's got a suit and he's got a big red cape. And the man who is talking in the narration is the man who's confronting him, and that is Dr. Fate. And he is hovering right in front of Sargon. And if you don't know what Dr. Fate looks like, he wears a blue leotard, and then he's got a big gold belt with gold gloves and boots, and he wears a golden helmet that covers his entire face except his eyes. And in the background, we can see Zatara, Zatanna's father. And there's another hero in a trench coat and fedora, but I'm not sure who that one is because they're kind of far away and there's not a lot of detail on them. And the ballroom itself is full of people, like guests of this lodge. So all those people are kind of in danger at this moment. So Sargon replies to Dr. Fate saying, "I'm afraid you are in no position to advise me, Dr. Fate. You choose to serve gods no one cares to remember, while I plan to become a god myself." And Zatara says, "More powerful sorcerers than you have searched for the Vatican's oldest secrets, Sargon. Crowley himself tried to rob the vaults not 2 years ago and was stopped by the Justice Society of America." And Sargon replies, "I will find a way, Zatara. I vow that someday my work will be completed." Then we cut back to present day, and we see Grace is pushing open the doors of this lodge, and reflected in her eye, we can see a person, but it's just the shape. It's not actually any detail. But she says out loud, "Uncle Johnny." But then as she goes in further, we see, no, there's no one there. It's dark inside. All the walls are falling apart. She kind of rubs her head and says, "Dear God, what am I doing here?" Almost as if she was in a trance or something. So she continues to walk in and she goes down some stairs, and the narration says, "The ruby throbbed in the palm of her hand, aroused by the scent of an old familiar. Grace Brady knew she was getting closer. Uncle Johnny was only a heartbeat away." And she gets to a door and she pushes it open, and it creaks as she enters. And as we turn the page, we see she's standing now in the room facing her Uncle Sargon, whose back is to her. And there's a giant pile of books in front of him, and one of them is hovering in front of his face. And we see that book says that it's Mother Hubbard and other nursery rhymes. So basically, he's using magic to read this book. And he must be engrossed because he doesn't even seem to acknowledge Grace. So she walks in further and says, "Uncle Johnny, is that you?" And Sargon replies, "I ceased to be John Sargent many years ago, Grace Brady. There are those who would use that name to destroy me. You must call me Sargon. Did you bring my ruby?" And Grace replies, "Yeah, I got your letter. My husband said it was a fake, but I knew you couldn't be dead." And then she removes the little pouch from her pocket that is holding his ruby, and it seems to be glowing brightly now through that pouch. And Grace says to him, "It's good to see you again, Uncle Johnny. Sargon, I mean." And then she hands him the ruby, and as he places it in the front center of his turban, he says, "One moment, niece. It has been years since I've held the ruby of life." And as he finishes putting it in place, he begins to hover in the air and he says, "Ah, wonderful. To flex the inner muscles of my mind, the rush of 1 billion years of perfect knowledge coursing through my veins. The pleasure is undescribable." And then he lands back on the ground, and Grace looks kind of scared, and she says, "You aren't going to, do anything bad with this, are you? I mean, you're one of the good guys now, right?" And Sargon looks at her and smiles evilly, and we see behind him there's a shadowy outline of Sargon, but the face is of a skeleton. And he kind of already said it, but I'm assuming this is what Sargon was talking about when he said that her uncle was no longer there and someone else is now. Then we cut to the outside in the Black Forest, and we get some narration that says, "Outside, a clap of thunder filled the October sky, and a murmur rippled through the heavens. All at once, the town of Freeburg came alive." Then we cut to a bunch of different scenes inside of Freeburg, where horrible things are happening. In the first one, we're seeing a father trying to protect his kids from a giant dog, and the narration says, Frederick Kroll's dog, missing for 2 whole days, shuffled into the yard and growled at the children, its eyes discolored and pus running from its mouth. Then in the next scene, we see a very large man naked, tied to the ground, and in the background there are 3 figures approaching him with weapons. And the narration says, 2 miles east, young Henry Cyberberg and his brothers wiped their lips and got ready to teach their violent father a lesson he'd never forget. Then in the next panel, we see a man and a woman holding something under the water in a bathtub. And the narration says, Klaus and Tasha Grossum just couldn't stand to hear their baby daughter cry, and so they held her underwater until she stopped, her tiny lungs bursting into crimson clouds. Then we cut to the final panel on this page, where we see a priest who is naked from the waist down, and he's got a bottle of liquor in his hands, and he's standing at his pulpit, and it seems he has pushed the crucifix to the ground, and the narration says, And in the Red Cathedral, Father Brungle finished his last bottle of homemade cider, and screamed to his God until his voice disappeared, and then he pissed upon the altar. Then we cut to an outside view of Freiburg, and specifically we're focusing on the clock in the center of the town, and the narration continues saying, And high above the town, a clock struck midnight 13 times, but there was no one left who cared. And the last shot of this issue, walking in the snow in the Black Forest, and he picks up the doll that Grace had been holding the whole issue. I guess she must have dropped it probably when she touched the tree. So Swamp Thing leans down and he picks it up, and he looks around cautiously, and that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains@comicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.